Okay, Kathy, you should be good to go now.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully you all had a chance to get to know each other a little bit. I'm going to ask whoever will be the spokesperson for breakout room 1 to tell us the 3 things you figured out you all have in common. Just introduce yourself when you speak.
How do we know which breakout number room we were in? That's the only question.
Was there a number at the bottom? I could see numbers. I don't know. Just somebody go first. Doesn't matter really.
Okay, this is Samia Chakraborty. I can go. I'm not sure about the number of the group, but basically, okay, number 1. Okay. So there are 3 common things that, like, we are mostly translational scientists or clinician scientists. So we are looking forward to translational work. And secondly is, grants, K awards, and grants which would actually help us to leap forward towards the new PI positions. And third is, of course, what are the nitty-gritty details, professional as well as personal development, to really apply for jobs for faculty positions, especially in this type of COVID scenarios and hiring freezes, all these things. So these are the 3 major commonalities.
All professional things in common. That's interesting. How about one of our other 2 groups?
I can go for our group. I don't know what group we were.
That's okay.
Okay, I'm Sakara Fisher. We identified 3 things. I don't think any of them were professional. They're all fun things. So one is that we've all been out of the country, and not recently, but in our lifetimes. We all love chocolate, and we all have gardens.
Excellent.
Yeah, that may have been started some point during quarantine or not, but yeah.
So if you're able to meet in person, somebody needs to bring chocolate and somebody else needs to bring stuff from their garden.
Yeah.
All right, how about our 3rd group?
We really dropped the ball and we got to know each other, but we didn't really find a lot in common as we were going through this. Some of us have pets, some of us don't, some of us have children, some don't. Not everyone is living in Georgia right now. One of our people is in Australia and it's 12 a.m. there.
Oh, wow.
Let's see. We are all researchers.
That's good.
Yeah. Can anybody else think of anything else? Oh, sorry. We didn't fulfill
That's okay. That's okay. The idea was just to get you talking to each other. So it sounds like you did that. All right. Well, you'll find more things in common, I think, as the year progresses, for sure. Okay. Let's move on and talk about the program goals very briefly. You've all seen these, I think, when you applied to the program, but just to remind you, the idea is that we're going to try to help you develop technical skills for working in a multidisciplinary team science environment. Nowadays, almost everything we do is team science in one way or another. And so being able to work easily in that environment is important. We also want to help you develop relational or interpersonal skills for working in these multidisciplinary teams, and also to help you develop networks to improve collaboration in multidisciplinary team science. You've already started with the last goal of this, and as you entered your learning communities, and you're already developing networks, and that will become more so as you meet all of your mentors. So I want to call your attention to this page on the website. We figured out that with Zoom, I can't share the screen without a lot of sharing and unsharing, so I'm just going to tell you about it. Lillian will show you later because she can do it from a PC. But on the website, there's a fellow toolkit. And that toolkit has a lot of resources. So if you're having trouble goal setting with your mentor, you can go to the first of these tabs. If you want to just make sure to make the most of your mentoring relationship, I strongly advise you to look at this tab on how to be an effective fellow. There's information on communication skills, challenges you might face, team science, diversity, which has become something very important in our world today. And then also things about harassment and professional development and additional resources. So it's a really resource-rich webpage. If you haven't visited it already, I strongly urge you to go ahead and visit it. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn the program over to Lillian, who's going to talk to you more about professional relationships.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Okay.
And I remind you, as Lillian goes on, please go ahead and enter any questions you have in the chat box. And we'll either call on you to unmute yourself or else I'll read the question to her.
So can you all see the PowerPoint? Great, great. Well, thanks. Well, this is definitely strange doing this on Zoom, but we'll make the best of it. Whoops, I think I have the wrong one up, actually. Let me exit out of this. There we go. Okay, guys, can you guys see the screen now? Okay, great, thank you. And you know, this is a session that I've done variations of for probably the past 25 years. It uses an instrument I really like, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. But I've never done it virtually, so this is going to be a little bit of a challenge for sure, because it's kind of a complicated instrument, and there's a lot of kind of nooks and crannies that I think give you really good insight into yourself and other people. So please use the chat function if you have questions, because I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. So before we start, a couple things. Kathy mentioned a few of these already. I do have some pauses built into the session for some Q&A. Because I have to look at this screen, I have a split screen, I can't really look at you guys for reactions, but Kathy will be monitoring questions. But when we go into Q&A, I might stop the PowerPoint briefly so I can actually see your faces and have a sense of if anybody is on the cusp of a question, or if you ask a question, I can see you. Of course, there's a chat box, as you know, and you know how to unmute yourself. And Lauren is going to be sending you the results of the inventory that you took online, which is called the Strength Deployment Inventory. And I would really request that you not read ahead and that you don't open it and start rooting around until we get there. This is a pretty complicated inventory, and I think you'll get a lot more out of it if we can kind of process through it together. Lauren also sent you a Word document for a little brief assessment on your conflict management style. And I believe she asked you to print that out. So if you haven't, that's fine. You'll have a time to print that out, but hopefully you're somewhere where you have access to a printer, because that's a kind of a really brief paper and pencil assessment we'll do, which really builds on this more deep dive into your motivational value system. So if you have a dual computer screen, it might be helpful, because that way you can look at the 3-color SDI along with my PowerPoint. If that's too fancy for you, you can split your screen so you can be simultaneously looking at the PowerPoint that I'm presenting and your SDI results. And I strongly recommend you do that, because it'll just make it a lot easier for you to see how what I'm talking about actually pertains to your results. So I've got a lot of examples like sample people, but being able to see your results alongside that would be helpful. And if you have any problems with that, please send a quick note to Lauren and ask us to just stop for a second so we can make sure that you've got all of your ducks in a row. So I'm assuming there's no questions, but Lauren, I don't have my chat box open, so maybe just break in if there's like something critical, or Kathy, if there's something critical, just feel free to go ahead and interrupt me. So
Nothing there so far, Lillian.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned when I briefly introduced myself, I'm a psychologist by training, but I'm not a therapist. I'm actually an industrial organizational psychologist. So what that means is I study the psychology of workplace behavior. And one of the areas of expertise that I have is around mentoring, and particularly around relationships at work and professional relationships. And so one thing we know from my own area of expertise, but also from clinical psychology and social psychology and sociology and lots of other fields, is that one thing that makes us, like many other animals, unique is that we have a real need to belong. And this is kind of a fundamental need. Having relationships, particularly satisfying relationships, is related to a whole host of outcomes, including things like mortality and disease. And so relationships are super important. Doesn't mean you have to have a lot of relationships. We know that some people have just a few really close relationships. Other people have a much broader network. But what's important is it does appear to be kind of a fundamental motivation. So that's the good news, right? The bad news, or the double-edged sword of this, is that there's also an enormous body of research on how relationships can be a major source of stress, right? So think about collegial relationships, think about friendships, think about romantic relationships, relationships with children. And, you know, even though these can be wonderful and supportive, they can also lead to conflict and be a major source of psychological stress. And so what we know from the research evidence is that a primary contributor of stress is differences in how we relate to other people. And part of that is we have our own way of understanding ourselves, but sometimes it's very difficult to perspective take. And so with this assessment, what I'm hoping is you'll not only get a deeper appreciation of what motivates you in relationships, but you might get some insight into what motivates people who are really different from you. And that, I think, we're not going to get into that as much today, but there's a lot of resources in the materials that I sent that might help you understand that dean or department head or colleague that you kind of butt heads with and you have difficulty relating. Understanding what motivates them and how that's different from you might be really helpful. So we're going to do two things, and one of the reasons that I like this instrument in particular, there's literally thousands of assessments out there. Many of them are not evidence-based. Many of them don't have a lot of kind of psychometric validity behind them. And this one has a lot of science behind it, which is one reason I like it. The other reason I like this inventory is it gives you kind of two perspectives. And one is your kind of preferred style of relating when things are going good. But then it also gives you a sense of your preferred style of relating when things are not going so good. And so for some of you, those styles of relating will be very, very different. For some of you, those styles of relating will be very similar. And each of those different configurations comes with a host of challenges in relating, and we'll talk about that. As I mentioned, this hopefully will also give you some perspective on why people act different than you do. We have something called the similarity attraction effect. It's an enormous kind of an underlying foundational finding that we tend to like people who are similar to us. So understanding people that are different from you and how to appreciate them can help with relationships. We'll also, toward the end, talk about a conflict management, which kind of builds on understanding your style when things are not going so great. And hopefully you can use this to improve your professional relationships. So any questions about where we're heading? Okay. So I mentioned I'm not going to get deep, I'm not going to do a super deep dive into the science behind this, but as a scientist myself, I think it's really important to use assessments that I would call evidence-based, right? And so this particular inventory builds on this idea that everyone wants to have relationships and we have this kind of fundamental need to belong. It has a lot of science behind it, as I mentioned, and it recognizes that people don't always act the same way, right? We have what are called kind of strong and weak situations. And in strong situations, sometimes the norms or what's expected can really drive your behavior. So for example, I'm actually pretty introverted, and I know Kathy is as well. But this is a strong situation where I have to act extroverted, I have to try to engage you, and even though it gets me out of my comfort zone, I can kind of modify my behavior in a context like this. Whereas in weak situations, we tend to act in line more with our personality because there's greater parameters on how we can behave. And so as I mentioned, this assessment will give you kind of two pieces of that puzzle: how you prefer to act when in conflict and how do you prefer to act when there's no conflict. So this is not the most comprehensive assessment that's out there. Personalities has many, many different dimensions to it. this is just one kind of component. It does map onto some other personality inventories that you may have taken. Another reason I like to use this inventory is most people haven't taken it. So many of you probably taken the Myers-Briggs or other kinds of really popular inventories, but this one is a little bit more, I think because it's more complicated, a lot of consultants don't like to use it. It requires some additional certification. There's a lot of science behind it. I'm going to leave it at that. We can talk more about that if anyone's interested. I will say that like any assessment, your scores or your results could vary some, right? So if you took this inventory when you had just had an argument with your spouse, or you took this inventory and you weren't filling it out very carefully, or you took this inventory and you were thinking about how you wish you were versus how you really are, you might get different results. So there is a possibility that your results could vary. And even though this is a measure of personality, there's a lot of evidence that you can move the needle in some of these dimensions, right? So if you learn about yourself and you're like, gosh, yeah, that is like me, and I wish I was more like X, this is not a personality characteristics that's not malleable, right? So with, with some, I won't say work, but with some effort and trying out different skills in kind of safe situations where the stakes aren't high, you can move the needle to some extent. So this inventory really takes the premise, like many personality inventories, that there's different styles, right? There's different ways that we relate to others, and they come into three broad categories, and then we're gonna look at them a little more for fine-grained. And so one of the basic styles of relating really focuses on a concern for people, and we call this the nurturing type. We're gonna refer to this as the blue type, and you'll see that in a few minutes. People who are nurturing value helpfulness, caring, tend to be highly altruistic. Another type, which we're going to call the red type, is assertive. And these folks are really motivated and concerned for performance. They tend to be a little more individualistic. They want to be in charge. They want to be leading. They like to feel in control. And the third are autonomous styles of relating. And these are folks that are really concerned about the process. They tend to be very methodical. They're motivated by, again, being independent, but just making sure they've really thought through things before they act. So they tend to be very kind of scientific and reflective in their thought process. So those are the three basic styles of relating. So you can be high or low on all of these. And so what we're going to see is simultaneously we're assessing all three, right? So you could be really high on nurturing and also high on assertiveness and really low on autonomous. So what this means is that if you take these three dimensions and you consider you could be high or low on any of them, it really creates 7 different what we call motivational value systems. And the first is a true blue type, right? So these are people that are clearly mostly motivated by altruistic and nurturing motives. So they have a very high concern for others. They place strong value on harmony, trust, loyalty. And one of the things that this inventory does a pretty good job of is it demonstrates what we call subgroup validity, meaning that people in certain kinds of occupations tend to fall in different motivational systems. Okay, so people who are in either helping professions or academic disciplines that focus on helping, this does tend to be still a little stereotypically female in terms of more female-dominated occupations. So nursing, social work, human development, etc. Not to say everyone is blue who works in these areas, but we do see some pretty systematic differences across occupations. So the second type are what we call the true reds, and these are folks that are primarily motivated by a concern for getting things done, task accomplishment, performance orientation, tend to again be a little more individualistic in their orientation. And you often see folks who are what we call true reds in competitive environments. And you can have a competitive environment in a helping profession, right? So you could have, for example, a school of medicine that just tends to have a very competitive environment. And so you might see, for example, a dean or a department head because Reds often aspire to be in leadership positions, who in an otherwise occupation that might be very nurturing and helpful, be a true Red, right? So competitive environments, more kind of entrepreneurial orientation. Again, this tends to be still a little male dominated. And I've got some examples here. Now this inventory is of course not just used with academics. So there's a lot of validity evidence in kind of the real world outside of academia. So we tend to see people in finance and sales and project directors and kind of high level leaders who often tend to be more Red. How's the pace? Am I going too slow, too fast? Can I get a couple thumbs up or thumbs down? Or Kathy? Okay.
Yeah, thumbs up. So
Okay, great. Thank you. So the third motivational value system is kind of a true green. And these are folks that tend to be very methodical. They're very concerned about kind of relying on themselves. They can be more introverted, excuse me, they can be more introverted, but really concerned about logic and order, very cautious, very principled, very practical. And often we see folks who are true green in scientific occupations or kind of more solitary professions. And I've got some examples there as well. So those are the three kind of pure, if you will, motivational systems. But remember, I said you could be high and low on all three of these, right? And so there's different ways that you can combine them. And so I'm going to talk.
Lillian, can I interrupt you with a question?
Sure, of course.
Question is, can people shift in attributes throughout life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So people can shift in attributes, but this tends to be pretty stable. So it often requires you to do something to try to change, right? So you might join a leadership development program. You might move into a different occupation that has different kinds of norms for interacting. So these do tend to be pretty stable, but they can be changed with, you know, with training and self-effort. The other thing I'll say about that, and I think it'll be clear in a few minutes, is it kind of depends on how strong your orientation is. So if you're someone that you are a blue and you are all in, and you are really low in green and red, it's going to be a lot harder for you to move to red, particularly red, because blue and red are kind of almost bipolar. You got nurturing and you've got competitive and driving. So it kind of also depends on your scores.
So there's another question.
Sure, of course.
Do people tend to have different MVS for home setting versus work setting? And then there's another question after that when you're done.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe, and again, I think this gets back to whether or not the context that you work in is a strong situation. So let's say at home you're real nurturing and you engage in a lot of altruistic and helping behaviors, but when you go to work, you're a high level manager, or you are a project director of a really complicated effort, and you're working in a competitive environment. That's when you could potentially exhibit some of those red behaviors. My guess is it might make you less comfortable. So there can be some switching. What's interesting is when you have to switch behaviors from work and family, that actually can be an enormous stressor. One of my other areas of research is work-family. And so we call that behavior-based conflict. When you have to use different behaviors at work than you use at home. That actually can be a psychological stressor, but that's kind of another presentation.
All right, 2 more questions. Is there a directionality to this shift? Example, red to green and vice versa.
Yeah, just hold that thought.
Okay. And the next one is, how repeatable is this quantitative measure?
You mean you mean test retest reliability?
I think so, Babak,
Yeah.
if you have a.
Yeah, it tends to have pretty good test retest reliability over pretty decent sized windows, like 6, 9 months, a year. But again, depending on what happens to you during that time period, you could see a shift. And an example that comes to mind is if somebody experiences maybe a personal tragedy. That could lead to, we know that those kinds of experiences can lead to fundamental changes in people's personality and styles of relating. But test retest reliability tends to be about 0.7, 0.75. So it's pretty stable over time, unless a person has either had a major life event or they have really taken efforts to try to change their style of relating. Those are great questions, though. Please keep them coming. Anything else, Kathy?
Not right now.
Okay, so we've got these three general styles. And then remember I said you could be high or low on any number. You could be high on all three. You could be low on multiple. And so we're going to talk about what happens when you have kind of a blended style. And the first style that's blended are what are called, it's kind of a strange title, they're called flexible cohering types. And we're going to refer to them as hubs, and you'll see why when we get to the briefing. And people who are flexible cohering, they really have scores on the red, green, and blue that are almost identical or very, very similar or not statistically different from each other. And so these are folks who can easily move between being assertive, nurturing, and autonomous. And this is really an interesting combination because these folks really value flexibility. They tend to be pretty adaptable to different interpersonal situations. They often, interestingly, tend to be in jobs where they have to work with people who have really different backgrounds and different kinds of orientations, different stakeholders, if you will. So I used to do a lot of this kind of work with state government back years ago when I was at a different university. And when we would do the SDI with these state government leaders, everybody would be in the hub. And it kind of makes sense. You think of like the consummate politician who has to one way to a different one constituent, has to act a different way to the different constituents. So we often see people who are blends, who are working in environments where they have to kind of please a lot of parties, if you will. This also might emerge in kind of a more interdisciplinary context, right? And so one thing, as we're talking about these occupational differences, that's important to note is that there could be two things going on. We know people tend to be attracted to occupations that fit their personality. So you could have what's called a selection effect. People are selecting in because they're flexible cohering. Another thing that could be happening is people just like a certain kind of work and they end up working in an occupation that shapes their personality to some extent over time, kind of getting back to that question of how much people's personality changes. So these flexible cohering types you're going to see when we do the debrief are going to be kind of in the middle of this triangle we're going to see in a minute. And it just means that they're moving back and forth between these different styles of relating. So that's a first blend. The second blend tends to be folks who are red and blue combinations and much lower on green. So they tend to be people who are interested in nurturing and motivated by nurturing, but really want to help other people and tend to be in occupations where they are advocating or working to try to improve others' lives. Okay, so people who work in the nonprofit sector, people who work leaders in, say, the prison system or the VA system, or people in working in healthcare settings where they're dealing with a lot of underserved populations, but in pretty high level positions. These are folks that have that mix of nurturing and assertive. So these are the red blues. And as I'm talking about these, my guess is you're probably thinking, okay, which one do I likely fit in? The next blend is a combination of red-green. So these are folks that tend to be very analytical, but also assertive. And they tend to be really good at using data and facts and logic, but to get results more for themselves. So they tend to be in more solitary type occupations. And they often feel good about themselves when they can kind of out-argue other people. So think about people who are in scientific fields where there's a lot of controversy or debate, and they're tending to work more independently based on their academic discipline. They may be more likely to be kind of a red-green. Or people who are working maybe in the financial sector where which tends to be very competitive, but it requires a lot of strong analytic skills. They may be more likely to be red-green. So this is the kind of assertive and autonomous combo. And then the final one are folks who tend to have who have the nurturing and analytic combination. So they value the use of logic and facts to solve problems for other people. And I think the best example here is like an advocate, like a court advocate, right? Or someone who's working in the hard sciences, but they're trying to come up with solutions to problems that will help other people. So they tend to kind of work more behind the scenes because they're more altruistic in orientation. They don't aspire to be in these kind of leadership positions, but they're very motivated by working with underserved populations. So those are our 7 styles. And I think I'll just make sure there's no clarification questions before moving on. Kathy, anything going on?
Nothing so far. I was just giving everybody a second to type.
Sure. Okay. So then the question is, one of my favorite bands, you know, who are you, right? What is your style? So, you know, as I've talked about these, I hope you have a sense of what you think you are. And if you're not sure, if you're like, well, I'm not sure, it might mean that you're orienting more toward the center and that flexible cohering type. So we're going to start diving in to the results. And so what I want you to do is I'd like you to go ahead and download and just open that SDI report just to the front page and try to resist the temptation to start reading. If you have dual screens where you can have this PowerPoint up and then the assessment, that would be great. Otherwise, I think Lauren sent you instructions in an email about how you can kind of make this screen a little smaller and then see your results side by side. If you're having any problem opening this report, please let Kathy know.
Lillian, there's a question.
Okay, sure.
So it appears that job requirements can influence these attributes. Can this influence lead people to change, lead people imbibe behavior unknowingly?
Can it lead people to engage in bad behavior?
I'm not sure what, maybe Abdul, you might need to explain what your question is because it's a little confusing the way it's written.
Yeah, you can just come on. If you want to turn off your mic.
Unmute.
Yes, I was just thinking about what you said, and I was thinking whether this extreme competition and job requirements and people pushing themselves towards fitting into the environment can lead to the behavior change unknowingly.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, and for absolute sure, I think what it often also leads to, though, is stress, right? So when people have to act in ways that's not consistent with how they feel inside, can lead to serious occupational stress. And there's a lot of research to suggest that. And it also can lead to turnover, right? So people can end up leaving a job or leaving a profession entirely when they figure out it's not a good fit. And, you know, it's really important to, you know, I'm an industrial psychologist, so I think about this stuff every day, but it's important to remember that choosing occupation doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to find a job that's a good fit for you or an organization that's a good fit for you. So, you know, you could be a doctor and be working in one environment and have it be a really good fit for you, and be working in another environment and have it really be a really bad fit for you. So we tend to make those initial occupational choices about pursuing a particular kind of career based on our personality. There's a ton of research to suggest that. But then people often forget that there's also a really important thing called person-organization fit, which is how your values and your attributes and your abilities fit with an actual organization you choose. So those could be in conflict. That's probably a long answer to a short question. Does that help?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks.
Great. So can you guys see the report that I have on kind of layered on top of the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this, I just wanted to show this. This is what you should be pulling up, and it's going to have your name up here. This one's anonymized, and I will be using examples from an anonymous report. It actually is randomly is one of you guys, but it's completely anonymized. So when you see it and you're like, gosh, that looks familiar, that's why I just picked one randomly. So hopefully you guys all have your report up. And so we're going to start by just talking about your motivational system when everything is going okay for you. So we're not going to talk about conflict yet. We're just talking about your typical style of relating. And I'd like you guys to go ahead and turn to page 3 of the report. We're going to skip some of the introductory stuff. And I want you to read about your motives and values. Excuse me. And one thing you'll notice right here is that you're going to have something here, right? And it might say red, it might say blue, might say green, might say blue-green, but this is your style when everything is going well, okay? You'll also see it reflected up here based on where you land, and you might land right here in the middle. That would be the flexible cohering hub, okay? And we'll talk about what it means to be here versus here a little bit later, but go ahead and just read page 3, just skim that, and then we'll kind of continue on. And if somebody can just give Kathy a thumbs up when you're done, that gives me a sense of when the group is likely to be done.
If you're not sure how to do that, at the bottom, there's a little thing called reactions. And you can choose a thumbs up or a clap. It'll show up over your photo. We have 1 thumbs up so far.
Okay, can we get a few more? I don't have to have everybody thumbs up. Normally, if I'm doing this in person, I can see people reading, so that's kind of my challenge here.
Go ahead and leave the thumbs up on your photo so I can track who's done it, who hasn't. It goes away after, there we go. Looks like most people have finished, Lily.
Okay, great. So
Everybody.
So this is, again, this is kind of your general orientation. We're not going to pay attention to this stuff down here yet. We'll talk about the conflict sequence in a bit. But we're going to go a little bit deeper here in terms of what these numbers mean and how that positions you on this particular triangle. But before we do that, let's just go ahead and have you look on page 6. And again, this is just a really brief summary, kind of summarizes what we've already talked about, but just maybe look at that and kind of gives you a more consolidated perspective. I don't need a thumbs up on this. I think it'll take you just a minute. So one reason I like this chart in particular, excuse me, is that it does also give you not only your own style, which will be indicated here by your results, it also gives you information on the other styles. So after you get a chance to kind of process your results, maybe think about people or a person maybe that you're struggling with, like you just don't understand them. They either come across in a way that doesn't jive with your interpersonal style. By reading these very brief descriptions, you can probably get a pretty good idea of what type they are. And more importantly, it gives you a sense of what motivates them, right? So if someone's not like you, then it's really difficult to understand why they're acting the way they are. So again, we're not going to get into this today because it's really TMI, but this has a lot of valuable information, even to understand a spouse or a child for that matter. And this is actually used a lot with couples and with families, not just used in the workplace. So again, thinking about your typical behavior, you have this motivational value system, and this person of example is a red. And so we can see the typical style of relating, and we're not going to have you read this right now. You can go back and look at this at your leisure. It's just kind of slicing the information in different ways, and particularly to help you understand kind of when you feel most responsible and when you feel rewarded, and what you're attracted to in terms of situations, what things you like to avoid. And this is one where you actually can also get some really interesting information about different types. So I'm not going to have you look at this right now. Unless people have questions, hopefully you have a good sense of how your style is relevant or what the characteristics are of your style. So I mentioned before that, you know, the way you answered the questions places you in a particular place on this triangle. So I want to go and take that a little bit farther. So if you go back to page 3 and you look at your scores, they're actually going to be listed in order of preference. Or actually, I don't know if they're listed in order of preference, but you'll see the scores. So this person is a 43 on red, a 36 on green, and a 21 on blue. So the highest score is this person's most preferred style of relating when everything is going well. And the lowest score is their least preferred style of relating. Now these values allows you to be plotted, if you will, on this triangle. And it's wonderful that we have computers now, because I remember the old days I would have to plot this stuff by hand. So this is wonderful. So with this particular person, you can see that even though they are red, they're bordering on green. So this is the red area. So and that's why these scores actually are quite similar. We'll talk about what that means in a second. You can also see that they're farthest away from blue. And being farthest away from blue is actually represented in their low score on blue. So they tend to be assertive and autonomizing, and they're less nurturing and altruistic. You might also notice that this particular person is getting close to this inner part, which we call the hub, which means that even though these scores are different, they tend to be somewhat flexible, particularly flexible in going between those kind of assertive motives and those analytic motives. So this person is a red-green, and the reason that they're a red-green is because, for those of you who remember your statistics classes or you teach this stuff, we have to, when we look at any scores on an assessment, we have to take into consideration the standard error of measurement and whether or not these numbers are actually statistically different from each other. And so based on this instrument, if you have two scores that are that have a 6-point or greater difference, then they're really not different from one another statistically. And so that's why, even though there's a slight preference for red, this person's actually a red-green, because there is a 6-point difference here. Okay, they're definitely not a blue, because 21 is obviously a lot more than 6 points different from green. Okay. Now, if this person was way up here in this red quadrant, this red score would be much, much higher. And then by default, these other two scores would have to be lower. Okay. If you remember when you filled out this instrument, I know it's been a long time ago, you were allocating points out of 100 or out of 10. I think it was out of 100. Maybe it was upscaled to 10. But if you add these up, it's 100. So it's like if you score low on something, you by default have to score higher on something else. Or you have to endorse the same, you have to endorse different things pretty similarly. So if we look back at those three scores, we see in this case, this person is red. And we already mentioned that this is a different person. This person is clearly red, and then there's no difference between blue and green. And so one thing to realize is that even though this person is red, this red person could be really different from somebody who's way up here on the red side. So, you know, putting people in buckets, we have to be kind of careful about that and not overgeneralize. And if you read your description of your profile and you're just thinking, I'm not sure that really sounds like me, my guess is that you're probably closer to this hub, right? People who tend to be more in these, the points of the triangles, those descriptions tend to be really spot on. But this also tells us how we deploy our strengths when all is well. So what this means is that in this particular situation, this person is most likely, all else considered, to act in ways that are more consistent with being assertive and directing. And then if that doesn't work, they're either going to switch to a nurturing style or an analytic style. Okay. So as you look at those 3 scores, it kind of gives you a sense of how do you deploy your strengths. Like, what's your first line of reaction? And then what would be next? And then what would be next? So how you deploy your strengths, which is why it's called the Strength Deployment Inventory. And as we're talking about these different styles, sometimes people say, well, gosh, I really wish I was in the hub. I wish I was really flexible. I wish I wasn't so much of a blue, or I wasn't so much of a green or a red. But actually, all of these styles have not only strengths, but some potential downsides. And I'll point you where you can look at some of that later on after we get done with the debriefing, at your leisure. So I'm going to pause for a minute and see if there's any questions. Or any concerns that you thought it was just really off track?
So you can go ahead and unmute yourself for this part.
Okay, I think we'll just move on. So hopefully you have a sense of what motivates you when everything's going well. And so I thought it would be interesting to show you the class profile. And so these are all the different types. And what's interesting here is that there's 2 types that over half of you fit into, and those are both blends. And one are the kind of asserting, directing types, those that are fighting the battle, but fighting them for other people, being assertive, but using those energies and skills to help others. That's the assertive directing. And the other most common type are people in the hub who tend to pretty easily move between autonomous, nurturing, and assertive, and don't have a clear preference for one or the other. Least common are the green-red, so the assertive people trying to out-argue and out-logic others, and also the blue-greens, the people who are using analytics to help other people. What you're going to see is interesting is how much you guys change when in conflict, so that's what's coming. So remember, this is when everything is going well. You tend to orient toward either being flexible in the center, kind of moving across these different motivational systems, being equally motivated by being in charge, helping other people, being analytical, or you tend to be the red-blue, where you're primarily motivated by being in charge and leading, but for others' benefit. So that's when everything's going well. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like to take 10 minutes and I'd like you to just discuss your results with your learning community. And so this is the same group that you did, I believe it is the same group that you did your icebreaker with. And I would encourage you to share your results. I mean, you don't have to, but I think it's helpful for your teammates to get to, your learning community folks to get to know you. So here's our learning community. So now we know what, I guess this is chat room 1, 2, and 3. And Lauren will place you in those separate chat rooms, and I'd like you just to discuss your results. I'd like you to just talk about what's similar and different among you and your learning community. And I'd like you to give some discussion to what type of people you have the most trouble interacting with and why. And why I think this is helpful is what often happens is the type of people that an individual has trouble interacting with might actually be in that group with you. And I might be able to give you some insight into what motivates them, right? And then I'd like you to just kind of reflect on, not so much for the discussion, but reflect on how your group's motivational value system might affect how you interact with each other as you work through the learning community. So we're going to start the 10-minute clock now, and Lauren's going to put you in those groups. And I may pop in. I want to respect your privacy, but I may pop in and just make sure you guys are doing okay. If you have questions, Lauren, they can pop back out, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm assuming people know how to do that, but if you don't, you can just use the chat function.